The world today is facing one of the greatest financial challenges in modern history. Are we approaching a new world order? Was all this foretold in Bible prophecy? From chaos in global financial markets to the spreading virus of public and private debt, we are accelerating toward an economic disaster in the making. Each one of us must understand the causes behind this looming economic threat and learn to practice the sound financial principles the Bible provides, so we can best prepare ourselves and protect our families before it's too late. And now, here is your host, Dr. David Jeremiah.
Never before have we read such jarring headlines, distressing news analyses, or dire predictions concerning the world's financial future. The American housing market, or more sentimentally, the American dream, began to collapse in 2008, taking with it large chunks of the global financial system. Millions of jobs worldwide have vanished forever. Did Bible prophecy predict this catastrophe? Are there biblical clues to how soon, if ever, a viable long-term recovery can be sustained? Is the financial collapse just one of several signs that we are living in the final days of Earth's history? Well, today I begin a new 10-week teaching series based upon my book, The Coming Economic Armageddon. Together, we will investigate what Bible prophecy warns about the new global economy. We began our investigation today by looking at the fall of the American economy. I'll explain the details and what you should do to protect yourself on today's edition of Turning Point. Bernard Madoff will no doubt go down in history as Wall Street's most notorious criminal. He systematically cheated investors out of $65 billion, far eclipsing the 1980s insider trading scandals involving junk bond financiers Michael Milken and Ivan Bosky. Among the thousands of Madoff's victims were a number of Hollywood celebrities such as Kevin Bacon and Kara Sedgwick. Zsa Zsa Gabor and her ninth husband lost almost $10 million. Director Steven Spielberg and DreamWorks executive Jeffrey Katzenberg lost money they had invested for their Wonderkind Foundation. Other celebrities who fell victim to Bernie Madoff were CNN's Larry King, former baseball great Sandy Koufax, and John Robbins of the Baskin-Robbins ice cream family. Also affected were prominent New York financial figures, some of the country's leading Jewish charities, Jewish patriot Elie Wiesel. Thousands of elderly retirees lost their entire life savings. And oh yes, Madoff's own sister, whom he scammed out of $3 million. Madoff took money from investors and used their money to pay out profits to earlier investors. As long as the new money kept coming into the system, it worked like a charm. His investors prospered, and he promised to continue the bountiful flow of steady income. 12 to 20% returns, he promised. Impossible? Of course it is. But he delivered on his promises. And when anyone would ask him how he did it, he would answer with some gobbledygook about split strike conversion strategies or investing from London. If he was pressed too hard, he would get angry and refuse to answer. His clients should be grateful for his wizardry. Quit looking for the levers behind the curtain. Some of his investors certainly assumed that he was cheating, but they did not press for details for fear of killing the goose that was delivering the golden eggs. As investment advisor Suzanne Murphy once said, it was a great con. The best cons are when you keep the pigeons happy, right? And the pigeons were happy because they were getting good returns. Madoff did not have to put ads in the Wall Street Journal to build his business. Customers were banging on his door, begging him to let them in. Some of his oldest friends would come up to him and practically beg him to take their trust funds. Madoff's charm was that he outfoxed the foxes He outscammed the scammers. In the history of high-stakes gambling, he outdid them all. Like Robin Hood with Alzheimer's, he stole from the rich. If only he had remembered to give to the poor, everybody would have liked him. Bernie Madoff, as you know, was arrested, pleaded guilty to 11 federal offenses, and in June of 2009, he was sentenced to 150 years in prison. Once worth millions, Madoff now lives at North Carolina federal prison, and according to a court report that I read, he eats pizza cooked by a child molester, sleeps in the lower bunk in a cell he shares with a 21-year-old druggie, and spends his time with a former Colombo crime boss and a spy for Israel. Now, 8 decades before Bernie Madoff's crimes, Charles Ponzi held the record as the greatest swindler in American history. Actually, the term Ponzi scheme is widely known as a description of any scam that pays early investors with ill-gotten funds from later investors. Ponzi's scheme began shortly at the end of the First World War and the start of the Roaring '20s. He promised his clients a 50% profit within 45 days or 100% profit within 90 days. And in the end, Ponzi was charged with 88 counts of mail fraud. He spent 3.5 years in a federal prison, and before being deported to his native Italy, there he died in a charity hospital in 1949. Now, one would think that Bernie Madoff wins hands down as the #1 Ponzi perpetrator of all time. But if you compare his scheme to what's going on today in America's system of finance, Bernie Madoff is just an amateur. Financing and administering massive entitlement programs and wars and runaways and big government has sunk our nation into a quagmire of deficits and debts and inflation. And our government seems to see no way out except to continue the policies that created the problems in the first place, to spend and borrow at an ever-increasing pace until the entire system falls on its face, exhausted from trying to outrun itself. This national Ponzi scheme was predicted 20 centuries ago in the New Testament letter of James and figures prominently as a sign of the coming economic Armageddon, and we'll look at that shortly. We're going to look at some of the causes and effects and the meaning of how Madoff-like greed and fiscal irresponsibility are contributing to the coming fall of the American economy. Let's begin, first of all, with Social Security. One of the earliest triggers of financial instability in America was the inception of Social Security. I have to be honest with you, when I began to study this, I was sort of under the impression that Social Security was quite a bit older than it really is. Roosevelt saw the Social Security Act in 1935 as a massive measure to assure young people who were wondering about what would happen to them when they got old. And he wanted to give them some measure of protection so that the family would be protected against the loss of a job and maybe poverty-ridden old age. Maybe the first part of it was okay, but like all entitlement programs, it didn't stay by itself very long. In just 4 years of passing the Social Security Act, Congress amended the program to include survivor's insurance. In 1965, Medicare benefits were added. By 2008, Social Security and Medicare had swollen to such a massive entitlement program, making it necessary to raise more than $1 trillion, or 1/3 of the federal budget. Today, Social Security functions like an unfunded entitlement program. While it is true that the government has raked in more in Social Security payroll taxes than it pays out in benefits, that money is not protected in any trust fund, as many are led to believe. The government uses the Social Security funds to pay for other programs. There is no such thing as a Social Security trust fund. There is no lockbox. Social Security operates exactly like the schemes of Charles Ponzi and Bernard Madoff. New contributors to the program fund the promises made to the older contributors. American workers who have faithfully paid their Social Security tax every year are relying on empty federal purses to fulfill its promise to them. And according to most economists, we are about to enter the perfect storm. As New York Times economics reporter Edmund Andrews reports, the nation's oldest baby boomers are approaching 65. setting off what experts have warned for years will be a physical nightmare for the government. What a good country or a good squirrel should do is stashing away nuts for the winter, said one writer. And the United States is not only saving nuts, it's eating the ones left over from last year. The first baby boomers are going to reach full retirement in 2012, but they've been eligible to collect reduced payouts since 2008, and they will be eligible for Medicare in 2011. In the very near future, nearly 80 million more squirrels are going to be scavenging in earnest for the few nuts that are still there in the government's quote-unquote trust fund. So Social Security has become one of our most ominous, unsustainable programs, leading to unending deficits. Richard Lamb, who is the former governor of Colorado, summed it up like this. He said, "Christmas is a time when kids tell Santa what they want and the adults pay for it. Deficits are when adults tell the government what they want and their kids pay for it." Former CEO of the United States Government Accounting Office, David M. Walker, has written, "If I were a young American looking at this kind of future, I would be marching out in front of the nation's capital, waving a sign that protested taxation without representation." Well, you take Social Security and put it aside for a moment. Let's talk a little bit about war and national defense. We spent more on national defense than China, Japan, Russia, Europe, and several other nations combined. In 2009, our defense budget was $642 billion, second only to Social Security, which is $677 billion. Our defense costs were 36% of the total income from taxes in fiscal year 2009. Then what can we say about the growth of government? The size of the United States government began to balloon back during the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt as his New Deal attempted to address the misery of the Great Depression. According to a recent State Department report, the rise of the United States as the world's major military power during and after World War II also fueled government growth. Greater expectations led to significant government investment in schools and colleges, and an enormous national push for scientific and technological advances spawned all these new agencies and substantial public investment in fields ranging from space exploration to health care. And it's not just the federal government that continues to grow. According to the same report, between 1960 and 1990, the number of state and local government employees increased from 6.4 million to 15.2 million. Today, the United States government is our nation's largest employer. Here's the problem with big government. Listen, there is no product. There's no product. We invest all this money in the government, and what do we get back? Well, we get some services and all the things that we need, but we don't produce anything that can create new revenue. And so we're throwing all this money into the government, and I don't think it's going to get better, at least not in the near future. Let's talk for a few moments about debt. Just one of the wrenching challenges facing the United States after decades of living beyond our means. Here's the problem, folks. America's debt at any level, it's not going to be paid. We will simply roll it over again and again until America's creditors are unwilling to loan any money to us. The nation is in the same position as someone who has taken a cash advance from his Visa card to meet his mortgage payment and then has taken out a new MasterCard credit line to pay off his Visa bill. Credit card debt juggling may appear to work in the short run, but it is a road to financial ruin. And just as compound interest is said to be the investor's best friend, compound debt is the worst nightmare you can come up with. So far, we've been addressing only the debt itself. Let's just talk about interest for a moment. If you have a mortgage on your home, as we do, you have probably experienced a reaction similar to mine when I get that statement every year and realize how much I pay on interest and how little of it goes to principal. If you got a new home and you financed your home, for the first few years, you seem like all you're doing is paying interest. You don't ever reduce the debt very much. Well, if you think that's discouraging, consider the U.S. government's fiscal year-end interest statement. According to the White House Office of Management and Budget, $904 billion came into the Treasury through tax payments at the end of 2009. The interest on our national debt was $383 billion, not the principal, just the interest. This means that the cost of interest on the debt represented more than 40 cents of every dollar that came in from individual income tax, and that does not even touch the principal. According to the Congressional Budget Office forecast for this decade, the government expects to incur $9 trillion in new debt. More than half of that amount will be applied to interest payments, $4.8 trillion. One financial professional has determined that the interest on the national debt accrues at the rate of $41 million an hour. Now, when you move past the nation's debt, you move to the private debt of citizens. And I know that's getting a little closer to home, so I won't spend too much time here. But household debt rose from $7.8 trillion in 2002 to $14 trillion in 2008 in just 6 years. That debt cannot possibly be paid off in one generation, so it's passed on in some cases to people who have not even been born yet. Here we are, supposedly the wealthiest nation in the world, and we are over our heads in debt. Shouldn't a nation with our wealth be known for lending instead of borrowing? I mean, that seems to have been God's perspective when he talked to the people of Israel. He said this to Israel, "For the Lord your God will bless you just as he promised you. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. You shall reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over you." How many of you know that what Solomon said is true? The borrower serves the lender. And one of the things that ought to be frightening to all of us as Americans is the realization that the longer we go without resolving these issues, the longer we go continuing to build our indebtedness, the more we put ourselves under the control of the nations to whom we owe this money. Already, China is doing some interesting things based upon the fact they know they've got us in a corner we can't get out of because we owe them so much money. Well, that brings us to another subject which, again, needs to be explained, at least if you're where I was when I started this investigation, and that's the subject of inflation. As the dollar continues to lose its status, the U.S. is going to have to bring IOUs with increasingly higher interest rates to attract lenders. In other words, China's going to come and say, well, you guys are in such terrible shape, we'll loan you the money, but it's going to cost you more to borrow this money. And those higher rates will cause consumer interest rates to go up in proportion. And this means that the cost of borrowing for homes and cars will get more expensive, partly as a result of the high rates themselves, and partly because rising interest rates will trigger inflation as the economy needs more dollars to meet the rising cost of borrowing. Most economists foresee a period of massive inflation as the economy begins absorbing the billions of dollars of stimulus money the federal government has printed. If you insert more printed dollars into the economy, listen carefully, the value of your existing dollars is decreased, meaning the price of everything goes up. Inflation isn't rising prices as much as we like to believe it is. Despite what politicians and money manipulators would like you to believe, inflation is not rising prices. That's only a symptom of inflation, just as sniffles are the symptoms of a cold. Knowledgeable people are well aware that inflation is an increase in the supply of money, period. Nothing more, nothing less. The more money the Federal Reserve prints and pumps into our economy, the higher prices are driven up. Hyperinflation robs money of its value. Here's an illustration from history. During the inflationary period of the 1920s in post-war Germany, the government printed so many marks that they were being used to light cigarettes and fires. Erwin Lutzer, one of my friends, tells a story in one of his books on Germany. Perhaps it's fictitious, I don't know, but it's the story of a woman who filled her wheelbarrow with German marks and left them outside a grocery store as she went to shop, confident that no one would steal the worthless currency. She returned to find a pile of marks laid out on the ground, and someone had stolen her wheelbarrow. It had far more value than all the money that was in the wheelbarrow itself. Deficits and debt and inflation all add up to economic chaos because short-sighted leaders tend to address the problem by creating more deficits and debts and inflation. And as a result, for the first time in my lifetime, the word trillion is being tossed around like a common denominator. I really didn't even know how much a trillion was. I mean, a trillion? Here's the illustration to help us grasp how much a trillion is. By the way, a trillion is a million, 1,000 billion. It's one followed by 12 zeros. Let me say that again. A trillion is a million, 1,000 billion. It's one followed by 12 zeros. California representative and member of the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, Darrell Issa, pictured it this way. If you spent $1 million a day, going back to the birth of Jesus Christ, that wouldn't even come close to just $1 trillion. The fact that our government and economists and media are beginning to think in terms of trillion instead of billion is not a good sign. It tells us that the economy is being filled with monopoly money, and the government's giant Ponzi scheme is ballooning ever more rapidly in order to keep from collapsing. What will happen when the government's giant Ponzi scheme catches up with itself? Well, according to a 2009 article in the Wall Street Journal, if the government were ever to default on its promise to pay periodic interest payments or to repay the debt at maturity, the United States economy would plunge into a level of chaos that would make the layman bankruptcy look like a non-event. I agree with those who say it's not very likely that our nation will ever be able to pay off her debts. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, any new health benefit programs require more funding than our tax structure can support. Even if the tax rates are increased, as we have been assured will happen, there just isn't enough money to buy our way out of debt. If the United States were to go bankrupt, it would morally default on everything it owes by just saying we no longer acknowledge our debts. The government would simply reset the value of our currency by declaring the worth of $1 with no real value to back it up. Taxes could go as high as 70% of one's income. If history repeats itself, revolution would follow shortly afterwards. There's nothing normal about an economy in which the federal government takes over giant automakers, bails out too big to fail banks, buys up nearly all mortgages, keeps short-term interest rates at zero, and prints over $1 trillion new dollars. We long for a return to normalcy, but it seems impossible to get there from where we are. The future is beginning to be clear. Barring some dramatic reversal, our nation is facing the most serious financial issues it has ever faced in its history. You may be surprised to learn that the Bible predicted the future, which is our present reality. And a passage of Scripture that you would never dream would have anything to say about it. A man who is not a prophet, but a writer of New Testament Scripture. His name is James, the half-brother of our Lord, the son of Mary and Joseph. He wrote a startling description of the economic conditions of the last days. Here's what he writes in James 5, 1 through 6. You can read it with me from the screen. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted and your garments moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived on earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in a day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the just. Now let me unpack that for just a moment. Although James wrote his letter to the Christian church, these first 6 verses of chapter 5 are addressed to wealthy non-believers. In doing this, James uses a rhetorical device known as apostrophe, a turning away from his real audience to address another group. James was not indicting these people because they were wealthy. The Bible makes it clear that it is not wrong to have wealth. In fact, the Bible says in Proverbs 10, the blessing of the Lord makes one rich, and he adds no sorrow with it. The Bible contains many notable examples of godly, wealthy people, such as Job and Abraham and David and Solomon and Nicodemus and Mary and Martha and Lazarus and Joseph of Arimathea and Barnabas and Philemon. James gives us 2 distinct reasons for the condemnation that is in this passage. First, He considers the sins of wicked, wealthy people to be especially grievous because they are being committed in the last days. Why would that make such a difference? In his commentary on the book of James, Homer Kent explains, the last days are a designation for messianic times, a period which began with Christ's first coming and ends at his second coming. These rich men were oblivious to the momentous days in which they were living. They did not understand that the last days had already begun and that Christ's second coming could be at any moment. Believe it or not, as far back as then, people believed, as we do today, that Jesus could come at any moment. They believed they were living in the last days as we do today. Pastor and teacher John MacArthur doesn't pull any punches in addressing the foolish audacity of amassing wealth in the end times. He says, James sharply rebuked them for hoarding their wealth without regard to God's timetable, the flow of redemptive history, or the reality of eternity. How utterly unthinkable to amass and hoard wealth as the day of judgment draws near. Those who do so are storing up wrath for themselves in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to each person according to his deeds. As James said in verse 5, these indignant rich people were merely fattening themselves up for slaughter, a vivid metaphor for the judgment they were bringing on their heads. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that 6 signs of corrupted wealth are rampant in our nation. And we can be sure that James' prediction of riches disintegrating into corrosion and misery is every bit as certain as his accurate prediction of today's economic abuses. In fact, it seems like it's already begun. Let's talk for just a moment about eroding wealth. When we think of wealth, we think of stocks and bonds and bank accounts and real estate holdings. But James writes of wealth in terms that would have been understood in his own culture. He speaks of corrupting riches and moth-eaten garments and corroded gold and silver. James points out to the wealthy that they are storing up wealth that is not enduring, but eroding. And I need to tell you, friends, nothing describes the current plight of our nation like the term eroding wealth. Can I get a witness? Just review with me for a moment. In 2008, U.S. households lost an estimated 18% of their net worth. This $11.2 trillion loss was the biggest since the Federal Reserve began tracking household wealth after World War II. From the end of 2006 through March of 2009, U.S. homeowners lost about 18% of the wealth they had in their houses. The total value of household real estate tumbled from $21.9 trillion to $17.9 trillion. $4 trillion in loss doesn't sound much, but remember how much a trillion is. Unemployment reached a record 10.2%, and here in California, it's risen past 12%. The number of Americans living below the poverty level rose to 13.2% compared to 11% at the start of the decade. The number of Americans without health insurance rose to 15.4% compared to 13.7% in 2000. National defense spending increased from $294 billion in 2000 to $642 billion in 2009. The price of oil tripled. The price of gold quadrupled. The U.S. federal budget deficit gap tripled to a record $1.8 trillion. U.S. public debt grew 31% to account for 53% of our gross domestic product and reached a record high of $1.4 trillion. As of February 2010, the U.S. government, now watch this, had run a budget deficit for 16 consecutive months. In fact, 2009 was the first year in 29 years of record keeping in which the U.S. government ran a deficit every single month of the year. The biggest single-day loss was in the Dow, and it occurred on September the 29th, 2008, when the Dow slumped 777.68 points, or approximately $1.2 trillion in market value. Some of our biggest and most secure institutions either failed or were bailed out by the government. The names are familiar: Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Washington Mutual, Covia, and AIG. The enormous erosion of wealth in this century's first decade shows clearly that the gleam from the American dream has dimmed. We feel alarmed not only because of the extent to which these events are affecting us, but also because of their rapid acceleration. Many are beginning to wonder if there is any force strong enough to reverse our headlong slide into national chaos.